welcome to the latest episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, okay, so due to public demand, well, alright, a couple of people said they might like to see an episode of the show on independently bottled Bunnahabhain, I am indeed doing said episode. It certainly helped that I had a couple of days off work, so it gave me the opportunity to have a good rummage through the boxes and found quite a number of interesting bottlings that I'd forgotten I'd actually had, and a number of them were actually quite old, as in the age statement. Well, the samples themselves are quite old as well, in actual fact. So much so that I had enough samples to do 2 episodes of the show, so I thought it would be fun to do 2 episodes. And so the first episode, this one, we're looking at youngish independently bottled Bunnahabhain, and then the next episode of the show I do, we'll take a look at some older age statement bottlings. So yeah, this is going to be quite interesting, I think. And but before we start, an apology to Morrison and Mackay. Basically, last year they released a really quite entertaining 4-year-old peated Bunnahabhain in their strictly limited range, and I really wanted to include that in today's lineup. But could I find that sample? No. So apologies that I've not used that particular sample, but I think I've got 6 interesting samples that should hopefully give a further insight into the characteristics of Bunnahabhain. Most of these, well, 4 out of the 6 are aged in American oak, so I think that will be quite interesting. 2 obviously are sherry, and I thought it'd be nice just to sort of, not necessarily to do all of them in American oak, because yes, the American oak aged example should hopefully show the character of the Bunnahabhain spirit, but it would also be interesting to have a look at a couple of independently bottled sherry cask releases. So yes, right, so first part of the independent Bunnahabhain double header, I suppose. Let's have a look at today's lineup then, shall we? Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with 2 Douglas Laing Provenance bottlings. The first one we'll be looking at is a 10-year-old bottled at 46%, aged in a refill bourbon hogshead. This was distilled in October of 2017 and bottled in February of 2018, so yeah, pretty up-to-date bottling. The cask number, for those of you that like these things, is DL12363. The second Douglas Laing Provenance bottling we'll be looking at is 2008. Again, it's 10 years old. This was distilled in June of 2008 and bottled in November of 2018. So again, a relatively recent and up-to-date sample. And the cask number was DL12949. Right, okay, so now we're moving a little bit backward in time for the third bottling, back to when Douglas Laing was just Douglas Laing and there was no Hunter Lang. So this is a Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask bottling. Again, it's 10 years old, bottled at their chosen ABV of 50%, and aged in a sherry butt, number DL8215. It was distilled in December of 2001 and bottled in March of 2012. So yes, going back a few years. And as is the next bottling, which again is a Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask bottling. This time it's a refill bourbon hogshead, DL7233. Distilled in August of 1997, bottled even earlier of August 2011, would you believe, making it 14 years old, and again bottled at 50%. And I have checked all of these samples, and especially these old ones, because I mean, when I was having a good rummage through the box, there were a number that had, shall we say, gone beyond the pale, and that's basically because way back then, before doing these episodes of the show, I used to keep a little bit just in case I needed to sort of retaste or something like that. These days, obviously, now I'm doing the episodes of the show, I tend to try and keep at least half of the sample, so we don't have oxidised, gunky mess left in the bottle. So anyway, moving on to the penultimate bottling. This is a current old malt cask bottling, so a Hunter Laing old malt cask, aged in American oak, and the code number is HL10128. Again, distilled in August of 1997, and this time bottled in October of 2013. And yes, we have an invading putty cat. Come home. Yes. So obviously, as you can see, Barbie's not just a peat head, she likes her Bunnahabhain without peat as well. Anyway, and the final bottling in today's lineup is a Goodrum MacPhail cask strength Bunnahabhain. It's an 8-year-old, bottled at 59%. It was aged in 3 first fill sherry hogsheads, numbers 326, 327, 329. It was distilled in 2009 and bottled in 2017. So hopefully be an interesting one to finish on. So there we go, 4 American oak aged bottlings, 2 sherry casks. Let's see how this one goes then. Right, note the correct glass. It is a Provenance glass, so let's see what the first 10-year-old Bunnah gives us then, shall we? That's a nice nose. It's very citric, young, exuberant, fresh, barleyed, quite coastally, wonderfully aromatic, really fresh. And this was this perfectly to me encapsulates Bunnahabhain without any sherry influence. It is a lovely whiskey. Yeah, all right. It's not what you would say majorly complex, but I think it's got a lot of interest. It's got the citrus, it's got the barley, it's got a little bit of oak, it's got some salt. Actually, quite some really nice fragrant barley as well. And the oak it's just really well balanced. The oak is really well harmoniously integrated. It's not OTT. Yeah, I'm getting a slight sort of floral note coming out now. That is a lovely nose. Let's see what the bar's like. Touch more oak on the palate, certainly to start off with, a little bit more toffee. But again, the citric notes really come through quite quickly on the middle. It's quite fresh, it's aromatic, and oh, for God's sake, Barbie, never worked with animals, as they say. Off there, come on. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, right, so it kicks off with a lot more of the oak. It's got a lot more toffee notes. The citrus and the salt kind of comes through quite nicely and quite quickly on the mid palate. It's a little bit simpler on the palate, it has to be said. But the citrus kind of lingers, and it's got a slight floral barleyed kind of character. So all told, I think that's a lovely 10-year-old Bunnahabhain. Right, okay, so let's move on to the second of the 10-year-old Bunnahabhains. So this is the 2008, bottled in November of last year. Let's see what the nose gives us. Right, so that's heavier, slightly oilier. There's a touch of the faints about it, the off the still notes. Denser, more sort of apricot, a little bit of heather. Not getting a huge amount of salt or coastal notes. So my initial sort of premise would be that this was purchased as a fresh fill, and probably hasn't spent any time on Islay. There's a little maltiness, but it's certainly showing a slightly sort of denser, less citric and more sort of malty character to the spirit, which is interesting. Let's see what the palate's like. It's a little short, and there's a little rose petally mar kind of note right on the finish. Right, so it's not quite got the, or should I say, it's not quite developed as much as the previous bottling. Again, it's quite oily, it's malty, it feels a lot younger. That doesn't quite have that sort of citric freshness. There's a touch of salt, but again, not as much as in the previous bottling. And although the spirit is really quite pleasant and you know, quite robust in comparison to the previous bottling, it's just a little too young. I think that could have just done with a little bit more time in the cask, possibly, but still, yeah, not a bad bottle. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two sherry casks. So this is the Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask bottling from 2012. Let's see what the notes goes on this then, shall we? Quite grain-like in actual fact. Lots of oxidised, high-toned fruit. Quite a lot of vanilla, spice, bit of muscovado, sugar. I'm not getting a huge amount of sherry character. It's not a dark, leafy, oloroso-y kind of nose. It's kind of, it feels more like a relatively aged grain whisky. It does seem a little bit older than 10 years old, it has to be said. Yeah, again, not hardly any salt at all. Well, practically no salt, so I'm guessing again this was a fresh filling purchase and hasn't been aged on Islay at all. Quite aromatic. Like I said, the sherry is very light. I mean, yes, I'm getting dried fruits, but those kind of dried fruits feel more like sort of an aged American oak aged grain whisky, which is quite unusual, it has to be said. Not what I was expecting. See what the palate's like. Rich, chocolatey, very chocolatey in actual fact. More sherry character now on the palate. The dried fruits are a lot darker. There's a little bit of herbal oloroso. Again, some lovely citric notes, which is kind of balancing that up. That sort of malty, sort of chocolatiness kind of carries on. I mean, it does. It's not the longest finish in the world, but it's got a lovely sort of wood spice note on the aftertaste, and that citrus kind of keeps on lingering and it really freshens up the palate. Again, no real saltiness, but you know, I think that's an interesting bottling. It's certainly not what I was expecting, or certainly after having tasted the distillery sherry matured bottlings, it certainly doesn't have that kind of commercial sort of soft silky rounded sherry cask kind of character. I mean, it's not gritty in any way, but it's a little bit, certainly on the palate, got a little bit more sort of interest, I think, even though the finish is a tad on the short side. So do you think you're fine?
Or are you just living with the
Right, okay, so let's move on to the 2011 Old Malt Cask 14-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now that's a lovely nose. This is kind of, to me, classic Bunnahabhain. It's almost tropical in an Arran sense, but not quite. It's quite, still got a lot of barley. It's got some lovely apricot. It's got plenty of salt, white fruit, almost a touch of peat. There is definitely a touch of peat there. I mean, whether that is kind of a deliberate, as we know, they produced the sort of the Moyne. I can't remember when they started producing the peated spirit. I mean, apparently they had many years ago, back in the Victorian age, they produced quite a lot of peated malt, but I forget when they sort of reintroduced it. And it's definitely got that sort of burnt wood peaty kind of note, and that's really starting to come out now. So it kind of started off as kind of classic sort of, American oak aged Bunnahabhain, has now kind of gone down the sort of the peaty road. Yeah, really interesting. Let's see what the palate like. That's a lovely finish. Stays juicy and fruity right the way through. It kicks off with that almost tropical fruit sort of, and barley and apricot and apple, and then in comes the sort of the peat. It's a sort of wispy, dusty, slightly earthy peat, quite astringent and briny on the finish. Really lovely intensity. Touch of burnt wood, a little bit of tobacco leaf, leather. That is a lovely mature, or mature-ish Bunnahabhain, shall we say? I mean that. Yeah, I mean, what more can you say? I mean, that is a lovely bottling, and well, it's long gone now, unfortunately. Right, okay, and let's move on to the 16-year-old. So again, fairly oldish bottling from 2013, but let's see what the nose gives us. Again, we're kind of gone back to sort of like that oxidised fruit kind of character. It's certainly showing some maturity. Slightly sweet barley, bit of dusty spice, touch of earth, almost manure, but not kind of quite. It's relatively straightforward, it has to be said, but again, it is showing that the spirit is kind of, a fruity spirit, and it's aged really quite pleasantly, it has to be said. Let's see what the palate's like. Quite tart, citric finish, a little bit of earth, a little bit of smoke. Again, it's got a little bit more oak, a little bit more vanilla, some straw-like barley. Again, oxidised fruit. It's, again, fruity, nice spicy aftertaste. Again, a pleasant malt. I mean, not hugely complex, but again, it shows that the Bunnahabhain spirit is really pleasantly fruity, and it ages quite nicely, given that sort of little bit of oxidation character, a little bit of smoke, a little bit of wood spice. Yeah, that's really quite pleasant. Right, okay, so let's move on to the final bottling. This is the MacPhail's 9-year-old first fill sherry hoggy matured Bunnah. Let's see what the nose gives us. Again, quite subtle on the sherry, quite toffeed, quite alcoholic in actual fact. White fruits, buttery oak, touch of treacle, a little bit of tar. Really fragrant barley. I mean, you know, I think if this had been this had not been aged in sherry casks, this would have been a really beautifully big, fragrant, aromatic malt. And it still retains some of that. You know, the sherry is relatively light, so you're certainly getting the distillery character, and you're getting the balance. Yeah, I mean that's really lovely. It has to be said, for a sherry matured Bunnahabhain, it's got the sort of, you know, elegance. It's got balance, which is great. Let's see what the pal's like. A lot more sherry on the palate. Oxidised, winey, pruny, soft sherry. A lot of alcohol. It really is masking the finish quite a bit. A touch of spice. More like Bunnahabhain, you know, from the distillery, and I imagine this is what you know, a young sort of distillery bottled Bunnahabhain would probably be like. Oh, I mean, spices on the aftertaste. I mean, with that alcohol, is really tingling. It has to be said. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it and see what happens to it. But yeah, so this is the closest in style to the distillery bottlings. Again, the sherry is relatively light. I'm getting a little bit of kind of coffee, a little bit of flambéed banana, apricot and grilled nuts. There's a bit of coastalness. I mean, I wonder whether these were again fresh filled and then shipped off to MacPhail's, because I'm not getting a huge amount of that coastal character. There's a little bit, so it's possible that they were freshly filled and then spent a year, maybe two, actually at the distillery before being sort of shipped off to Elgin, possibly. But yeah, it's pleasantly nutty now. It is, like I said, it's very much in the distillery style, should we say? That very sort of polished sherry, and again, no blemishes, no sulphur. You know. Let's see what the pal's like. Less woody, less alcoholic, obviously. Still quite drying on the finish, quite a bit of tannin, but it's quite soft tannin. There's a sort of slight sort of marmalade-y, orangey kind of note kind of coming through, but it is still pretty drying. There's a little dark chocolate note in amongst the tannins on the finish, a little bit of spice as well. Again, not a great deal of salt. But still, you know, if you like the sort of distillery style, then you would certainly be well and truly at home with that particular bottling. Yeah, chewy, quite big. Yeah, not too bad. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So I think sort of quite an interesting look, I mean, at Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So, yeah, quite interesting, and if you excuse Barbie trying to demolish everything here, I think sort of it certainly shows that what the character of Bunnahabhain is like. I mean, it is a very soft, slightly summery, occasionally quite citric style of whiskey, and it really works well in American oak. So it's still one of these kind of, you know, conundrums. Why doesn't the distillery bottle a wholly American oak aged bottling? Because if they bottled one that was just like the first Provenance bottling with that lovely salty citric freshness, I mean, that would just go down a storm, I think. Or maybe not. Maybe that's why they don't do it. Maybe the people that buy Bunnahabhain want the big sherry. I don't honestly know. But that was, you know, that was a lovely bottling. A little bit more oak in the second of the two Provenance bottlings, and it came across a little bit younger. There was that sort of slightly off the still kind of note, and ideally I would have, if it was me, I would have left that in the oak for another couple of years, just to sort of like to take that slight edge away from it. But again, you know, a pleasant American oak aged bottling. The old malt cask sherry, yeah, I mean, again, very subtle on the sherry, and kind of worked for me quite nicely, I thought, and again showed the sort of a slightly sort of grittier element, a little bit more of a tannic element to the sherry, and it probably shows that when, yeah, the distillery vats together a number of casks, it kind of works itself out, if you see what I mean. If you had the odd slightly tannic sherry butt in the whole sort of grand scheme of things, it kind of gets, you know, lost in amongst the softer sherry casks. So, but still, really, really nice. The 14-year-old. Yeah, really impressive, showing some lovely maturity, showing some, you know, quite almost tropical fruit. Like I said, it reminds sort of an Arran-esque kind of bottling, and again you can see the sort of the fact that the malt, the whiskey itself, the spirit is very fruit orientated, and in this instance a little bit sort of more fruity than say the two Provenance bottlings, but again, really interesting whiskey. And the 16-year-old showed that, yeah, okay, so maybe it lost a little bit of complexity, but certainly had some lovely maturity. You know, definitely had that sort of aged American oak character. The barley was coming a bit straw-like. There was, you know, some lovely sort of oxidised fruits. And all told, I think that was a really pleasant bottling. And the MacPhails, like I said, probably of all of the bottlings closest in style to the distillery releases. But again, I think even though it was, you know, 3 first fill sherry hogsheads, that it wasn't overtly sherry monster. Yes, the more sherry character on the palate, but I thought it still showed some really, really good balance, and yeah, not too shabby, as they say. So there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Like I said, the next episode of the show will be looking at some distinctly older bottlings of Bunnahabhain, and there's hopefully a couple of really interesting ones, so I need to check that they're still actually alive and kicking. But anyway, until then, I don't seem to have any whiskey left to toast you with, so all that's left to say is until then, good ramming and good luck.
I can live a life beyond my touch, but still I yearn for